Imagine owning a continent and still being broke. That was the Habsburg condition for most of the 1500s. The family that claimed dominion over Mexico, Peru, the Caribbean, and roughly half of South America declared bankruptcy 4 separate times between 1557 and 1607, while sitting on the largest silver deposit the world had ever seen. But how does a dynasty that owns half a hemisphere run out of money? And who exactly was collecting the bill? In the counting houses of Seville, sometime around 1552, the smell was ink, tallow, and anxiety. Clerks sat hunched over oak tables that had absorbed decades of spilled wine and financial dread, their quills scratching through ledgers so thick they could stop a crossbow bolt. The candles guttered. The coins clinked, silver reels from the mines of Potosi being sorted, stacked, and recorded with the cheerful efficiency of men who understood that if the numbers were wrong, someone considerably more powerful than their supervisor would eventually notice. And by notice, we mean execute. This was the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade, established in 1503 by the Spanish crown to manage commerce with the New World. That name, House of Trade, is doing a great deal of work. It sounds like a merchant's office. Something modest. Something with a bell above the door. What it actually administered was the entire economic infrastructure of Spain's colonial holdings across the Western Hemisphere. Not a trading post. A continent. Several, really. Here is the central irony that will follow us through this entire story. The Habsburgs, the dynasty that ruled Spain and her overseas territories throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, never quite treated Latin America like an empire. Empires are grand. Empires have poetry. What the Habsburgs built was something colder and, in its way, more impressive. They built a balance sheet with a coastline. Think of it this way. When Charles I of Spain and fifth of the Holy Roman Empire inherited his throne in 1516, he did not receive a kingdom so much as a portfolio. The Americas were assets. The indigenous populations were labor costs. The silver mountains of Peru and Mexico were, in the language a modern financier would recognize immediately, the underlying collateral on a series of extraordinarily ambitious loans. The Habsburg Empire was, at its operational core, a leveraged buyout of half the Western Hemisphere, financed on credit and running permanently, magnificently, in the red. Which raises the obvious question, who exactly was lending them the money? The answer involves 2 German banking families whose names deserve to be far more famous than they are. The Fuggers of Augsburg and the Welsers, also of Augsburg, were among the most powerful financial institutions in the 16th century world. The Fuggers had already bankrolled Charles's election as Holy Roman Emperor, a transaction that cost roughly 850,000 florins and which historians have politely described as an investment in political access. The Welsers went further. They didn't just lend money to the empire. For a period in the 1530s, they actually governed a chunk of Venezuela as a private concession. A banking family, running a colony as debt repayment. The candlelight catches the edge of a coin. A clerk dips his quill. Somewhere in those ledgers, buried between shipping manifests and mortality tallies, is the paper architecture of an empire that was never really about glory at all. It was always about the numbers. And the numbers, as we are about to discover, were extraordinary in every possible direction. Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, had a motto that his descendants would live by for 2 centuries. let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It sounds charming. It was, in practice, the most ruthless foreign policy in European history, conducted entirely through wedding invitations. Maximilian was not a man blessed with obvious military genius, but he understood something that most kings of his era did not. Conquest is expensive. Conquest requires armies. Armies require food, horses, wages, and a tolerance for watching your best men die in a field somewhere. Marriage, by contrast, costs a ceremony and a dowry negotiation. And if you were very, very good at it, the returns were spectacular. Consider what one generation of careful matchmaking produced. Maximilian arranged the marriage of his son Philip the Handsome to Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the same Ferdinand and Isabella who had funded a minor Genoese sailor's voyage in 1492 and inadvertently acquired a hemisphere. Through that single union, the child who resulted, a boy named Charles born in 1500 in the Flemish city of Ghent, would eventually inherit Castile, Aragon, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, the Spanish overseas territories, the Netherlands, the Habsburg ancestral lands in Austria, and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. He received this staggering accumulation before he turned 20. He had been raised speaking French. He did not initially speak Spanish. His new subjects were, let's say, cautiously optimistic. Imagine receiving that inheritance. Not as a king acceding to one throne, but as a young man suddenly responsible for territories so vast that no single human being could physically visit them all within one lifetime, which Charles would eventually discover through exhausted personal experience. Here is where the paradox sharpens into something genuinely strange. Charles V was, on paper, the wealthiest monarch in Christendom. He ruled the New World's silver routes, the trading networks of the Netherlands, the agricultural wealth of Castile. He had more land beneath his name than any European ruler since Charlemagne. And he was, functionally, constantly broke. The structural reason for this was sitting in the debt Ferdinand and Isabella had left behind. The Reconquista, the final push to expel Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula, had not been free. Columbus himself had not been free. The wars that created the unified Spanish kingdom arrived with a bill attached, and that bill had been quietly accruing interest while everyone celebrated. Charles inherited not just the empire, but the financing arrangements that made the empire possible. Every piece of silver extracted from the Americas was already, in a sense, spoken for before it arrived. Creditors had claims. Bankers in Augsburg, which a sharp listener will recognize from our previous chapter, had liens. The richest monarch in the world spent his reign in a state of permanent financial improvisation, robbing one account to cover another, pledging future silver revenues against present military needs. The throne was magnificent. The books behind it were a disaster. Which raises an obvious question. If the man who owned half of Latin America was perpetually bankrupt, what exactly happened to all that silver once it left the mines? In 1419, the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire were, like most powerful men in history, extremely open to persuasion. Electing a Holy Roman Emperor was not a spiritual exercise. It was an auction conducted in Latin. The candidates in 1519 were Charles of Habsburg and Francis I of France, and both understood that winning required, above all else, a very good banker. Charles had Jakob Fugger of Augsburg. This turned out to be the more important variable. Jakob Fugger was not a dramatic man. He was a ledger man. He wore simple clothes, kept meticulous records, and had financed enough wars, popes, and coronations to understand that power at its core was a receivable account. When Charles needed 850,000 florins to bribe the electors into handing him the empire, Fugger provided it. He did not do this out of loyalty. He did it because Fugger money had been building toward this moment for 30 years, and a Habsburg emperor meant a return on investment that no mere merchant could achieve. The bribery worked beautifully. Charles won. The electors pocketed their florins. Francis I went home to France in a mood that would eventually produce several wars. And Jakob Fugger sat in Augsburg with a piece of paper that was functionally a lien on the Holy Roman Empire. He was not shy about this arrangement. Years later, when Charles was slow to repay his debts, Fugger wrote him a letter so breathtakingly direct that historians still find it slightly uncomfortable to read. He reminded Charles in careful prose that without Fugger money there would have been no imperial crown. He was right. He was also, and this is the darkly funny part, completely correct that it would not matter. Charles acknowledged the letter and continued being slow to repay. The Fuggers were not alone. The Welser family of Augsburg sat beside them in the shadow government of the empire, financing the same Habsburg machine through the same Antwerp banking networks that had become the invisible circulatory system of global trade. Where the Fuggers preferred mining revenues and papal contracts, the Welsers were willing to accept stranger collateral. In 1528, when Habsburg debts reached a level that required creative solutions, the Welsers accepted Venezuela. Not metaphorically. The family received the actual territory of Venezuela, the right to govern it, exploit it, and extract whatever value they could find from it, as repayment for loans Charles could not otherwise cover. A German merchant banking family from Augsburg was handed a South American colony the way a pawnbroker accepts a watch. The Welser experiment in Venezuela lasted until 1556 and was, by any measure, a catastrophe for the people who already lived there. But the logic was perfectly coherent from the Habsburg accounting perspective. The debt existed. The territory existed. A transaction occurred. This was the engine underneath the glittering surface of the empire. Antwerp, not Seville, was the real capital. The Flemish and German banking houses operating there processed the silver revenues, extended the credit lines, and collected the interest that made every military campaign, every royal wedding, every colonial expedition financially possible. They were, in a functional sense, the government of the empire that Charles nominally governed. What the Habsburgs were inventing, piece by desperate piece, was the asiento system, the practice of assigning colonial revenues, monopolies, and rights to private financiers before those revenues even existed. Future silver production pledged against present loans. Future trade routes sold before the roads were built. It was privatization applied not to existing wealth but to anticipated wealth, a financial instrument sophisticated enough that modern economists recognize its structure immediately. The empire ran on credit. The credit ran on collateral. The collateral was, increasingly, the Americas themselves. Which returns us to the colonies and the men Charles sent to govern them once the bankers had finished deciding they were worth having. At 15,400 feet above sea level, the air at Cerro Rico smells like iron and cold stone, and it will kill you slowly enough that you almost get used to it. The mountain was discovered in 1545. a rust-red cone rising above the Bolivian altiplano like something the Earth left out by accident. Within a decade, it was the most valuable piece of real estate on the planet. Not because of what grew on it. Nothing much grew on it. Because of what was inside it. The Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, contained a silver deposit so vast that when Spanish assayers first calculated its yield, they reportedly sat down and did not speak for some time. By 1600, the city of Potosi that had grown around its base held 160,000 people. London had approximately the same population. Paris was comparable. A mining camp at the roof of the world had become, in 55 years, one of the largest cities on Earth, fed by silver and sustained by the bodies of the men sent into the dark to retrieve it. Those men did not choose to be there. The Mita system, inherited from Inca administrative tradition and then compressed into something far more brutal by Spanish colonial management, required indigenous communities across Upper Peru to send a seventh of their adult male population to Potosi on rotating drafts. They walked, sometimes weeks, knowing the odds of a full return were not favorable. The thin air at over 13,000 feet meant every breath delivered less oxygen than a lowland body expected. The tunnels delivered less still. Mercury made it worse. The amalgamation process introduced in 1572, which used liquid mercury to separate silver from crushed ore, was efficient and poisonous in equal measure. The workers who handled it absorbed it through their skin, inhaled it in the refinery fumes, and carried it home in their bodies. The trembling came first. Then the neurological collapse. The Spanish had a phrase for the condition. They called it the sickness of the mines, and then continued operating the mines. Contemporary estimates suggest that over the roughly 3 centuries of Potosi's major production, 8 million people died in the service of the mountain. The Spanish said, with a candor that was not quite remorse, that you could build a silver bridge from Potosi to Madrid on what the mountain produced, and pave it with the bones of those who produced it. They said this as though it were a boast. The silver crossed the Atlantic in convoys. It flowed through Seville into the Antwerp banking networks the previous chapter described, and from there into every war, every debt repayment, every strategic marriage the Habsburgs needed to finance. The empire that ran on credit, as we have seen, needed collateral. Cerro Rico was the collateral. One hollow mountain holding up the entire apparatus. Here is the irony that would amuse no one alive at the time. All that silver, that incomprehensible flood of metal, produced not stability but dependency. The more Potosi gave, the more the empire spent. The more the empire spent, the more it needed. Which is where the administrators come in, the men the crown sent to manage the impossible distances between Madrid and a continent that had its own ideas about being managed. The treasure fleet left Havana twice a year, and the Casa de Contratación in Seville had a ledger for every ingot that was supposed to arrive. The key word is supposed. The system was, on paper, elegant. Silver mined at Potosi traveled overland to the Pacific coast, crossed to Panama, was hauled across the isthmus on muleback, reloaded onto ships at Portobello, and then joined the great convoy northward through the Caribbean, past Cuba, and across the Atlantic in armed formation. The flota system existed because individual ships full of silver were simply invitations addressed to pirates. Together, they were harder to rob. The Spanish crown took its cut, the royal fifth called the Quinto Real, and the remainder passed through the Casa de Contratación in Seville. the official clearinghouse for all colonial trade, where clerks recorded, weighed, and cataloged the incoming wealth of an empire. And then, almost immediately, it left. By the time silver reached the docks at Seville, most of it was already spoken for. Not by Spain. By the men Spain owed money to. The Habsburgs had been borrowing against anticipated silver shipments for decades, pledging future cargoes as collateral for present wars, and the creditors waiting on the other end of those pledges were not Spanish. For much of the 16th century, they were German. The Fugger family of Augsburg had financed Charles V's election as Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, and the repayment schedule that followed was, to put it charitably, aggressive. Silver arrived in Seville and continued almost without pause toward Antwerp and Augsburg, following debt north like water finding a drain. By the 1580s, the Fuggers had been substantially replaced by a new set of creditors, the Genoese banking networks, which proved even more sophisticated at extracting value from Habsburg desperation. The Genoese operated through a system of international credit fairs, most famously at Besançon, where letters of exchange rather than physical metal moved the effective wealth across borders. Spain provided the silver. Genoa provided the financial architecture. Spain got the wars. Genoa got the profit. The empire was not a reservoir. It was a funnel, wide at the colonial end and narrow at the European one, pouring extracted wealth directly into the accounts of foreign financiers. Potosi bled. The mule trains crossed Panama. The fleets crossed the Atlantic. Seville stamped the paperwork. And the money kept moving, past Spain, always past Spain, toward the counting houses of men who had learned that the most reliable way to profit from an empire was to lend it money at interest and wait. Which meant that when the silver eventually slowed, as all mountains must, Spain was left holding the debt. Bartolomé de las Casas arrived in Hispaniola in 1502, and for about a decade he did not particularly object to any of it. He held an encomienda himself. He had indigenous laborers work his land. He attended Sunday Mass, felt reasonably virtuous, and participated without apparent distress in the administrative machinery of colonial extraction. This is worth holding on to, because it tells you something about how ordinary the system felt to the people inside it. The encomienda worked like this. The crown, having theoretically claimed sovereignty over the Americas, could not actually govern them from Seville. The solution was elegant, in the way that a trap is elegant. Conquistadors and early settlers were granted not land, but people. Specifically, the right to extract labor and tribute from a defined number of indigenous individuals in exchange for, and this is the charming part, providing them with Christian instruction and protection. It was a franchise model. The crown outsourced the violence, kept a percentage of the output, and retained the legal fiction that everyone involved was a subject, not a slave. The requerimiento completed the legal architecture. Before an armed party could claim indigenous people as laborers, they were required by law to read aloud a document explaining Spanish sovereignty, the authority of the Pope, and the consequences of resistance. In Spanish. To people who spoke Nahuatl or Quechua or Taino. Lawyers had drafted it in Burgos in 1513. It was technically, legally sufficient. What it actually accomplished was to fill the humid air with Castilian syllables that no one understood before the swords came out. Don't worry. The paperwork was in order. Las Casas eventually found his conscience, became a Dominican friar, and spent the rest of his long life writing down what he had seen. His A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, completed around 1542, described dogs trained to hunt humans, mass burnings, and labor conditions in the mines that consumed bodies at a rate the encomienda holders simply absorbed as a cost of doing business. He presented his testimony to King Charles V directly. The smell of the evidence was impossible to ignore. The result was the new laws of 1542, which restricted the encomienda system, prohibited indigenous slavery, and began phasing out hereditary grants. The encomenderos of Peru responded by murdering the viceroy sent to enforce them. The laws were revised within 4 years. The system continued for another century and a half. This was, from the Crown's perspective, not entirely a failure. The encomienda had never been about justice. It had been about revenue generated at arm's length, extracted by men who could be blamed when the system became embarrassing and rewarded when it produced silver. The Crown collected its taxes. The encomenderos collected their labor. Las Casas collected his horror and pressed it into ink. The indigenous populations, caught between a legal document no one translated and a franchise system no one dismantled, paid the price in the dark of the mines. Which returns us to those mines and to the question of who, specifically, was doing the digging. Philip II ruled an empire that stretched across 4 continents, and in 1575 he could not make payroll. This is not a metaphor. The soldiers garrisoned in the Netherlands, the most expensive military theater in the Spanish world, went unpaid for months at a stretch. Some of them responded to this situation by sacking Antwerp in 1576, killing approximately 8,000 civilians, because when an empire fails to honor its contracts, the contracts find other ways to settle. It became known as the Spanish Fury. The bookkeepers in Madrid called it a cash flow problem. The machinery behind this spectacular failure had a name: the juro. A juro was a government bond, and on paper it was a perfectly reasonable instrument. The Crown needed money now, merchants and bankers provided it, and in return they received a guaranteed annual payment drawn against future revenue. The revenue in question was increasingly silver from the Americas. Silver that was still underground. Silver that had not yet been mined, smelted, shipped across the Atlantic, or survived the considerable hazards of that journey. Spain was borrowing against the contents of a hole in the ground that men were still digging. The system made a kind of dreamlike sense if you did not think about it too carefully. Potosi was producing staggering quantities of silver by the 1560s. The mountain was real. The ore was real. The future payments were, therefore, real in the way that a promise made in good faith by someone who cannot see the future is real. Bankers in Genoa and Antwerp bought Spanish debt because the empire was too large to fail. This, as it turned out, was incorrect. Philip declared bankruptcy in 1557, before he was even technically king of Spain. He did it again in 1575. Then 1596. Then 1607, though by that point his son Philip III was handling the paperwork. 4 sovereign defaults in 60 years, each one politely called a suspension of payments because the word bankruptcy sounded undignified for a man who owned Peru. The Asiento system layered another absurdity on top. Military contracts were awarded to financiers, typically Genoese, who would fund a campaign now and be repaid in colonial silver later. The Army of Flanders, 80,000 men at its peak, was marching across northern Europe on credit backed by hypothetical Andean ore. The supply chain ran Potosi Mountain to Mule Train to Pacific Port to Seville to the Casa de Contratación to Genoa's bankers to Flemish campaign coffers. Any disruption anywhere along that chain, a storm, a pirate, a bad mining season, and the soldiers simply stopped being paid. The soldiers, having opinions about this, occasionally stopped being soldiers. The deeper irony is one that would become very familiar to empires that came after. The silver did not stay in Spain. It flowed through, paying foreign bankers, foreign suppliers, foreign armies, and eventually settling in Amsterdam and London, where it quietly financed the competitors who would dismantle the whole arrangement in the following century. The empire was a pump, and the question of who controlled the pump, the crown, the bankers, or the men with swords was about to become very complicated. The Army of Flanders had a bookkeeping problem. Specifically by the 1570s, Spain was spending somewhere between 3 and 4 million ducats per year fighting the Dutch in a war that would last 80 years, and the silver meant to cover it kept arriving late, or not at all, or already spoken for by the Genoese bankers who had technically already paid for the last campaign. The Dutch revolt began in 1568 as a tax dispute. It would end in 1648 as the birth of a nation. In between, it consumed more American silver than any other single enterprise the Habsburg dynasty ever attempted. Philip II did not see it as a choice. The Netherlands were Habsburg inheritance, and you did not surrender inheritance. You mortgaged Peru first. The soldiers understood none of this, and frankly, they did not care. They cared about the 6, 8, sometimes 24 months of back wages that had evaporated somewhere between Potosi and the Flemish mud. An unpaid army is not, strictly speaking, an army. It is an armed population with grievances, and in November of 1576, approximately 17,000 of those grievances marched into Antwerp. The sack that followed lasted 3 days. Perhaps 8,000 civilians died. A third of the city burned. And here is the particular cruelty of the ledger. Antwerp was not merely a city Spain had failed to protect. Antwerp was the financial capital of the Spanish Empire in Northern Europe. The place where the silver flows were managed, where the debt instruments were issued, where the whole elegant machinery of Habsburg credit was housed. Spain's unpaid soldiers had just destroyed Spain's own bank. It was called the Spanish Fury. It was also called, in quieter rooms, a catastrophic miscalculation. What it revealed was the fundamental structure of Latin America's relationship to the Habsburg project. The continent was not a place to govern, invest in, or develop. It was a fuel source. Potosi and Zacatecas existed in Habsburg calculations the way a coal seam exists in an industrial calculation. Something to extract from until it runs out, with minimal concern for what is left behind. The silver went up, it crossed the Atlantic, and it burned in European wars that Latin Americans had no part in choosing and no interest in winning. The irony, sitting comfortably in the warmth of historical distance, is that all that silver bought Spain a draw. The Dutch got their republic. The Habsburgs got the debt. And the mines kept producing, because the wars were not over yet. By the 1580s, a loaf of bread in Castile cost roughly 5 times what it had cost in 1500. The silver was working exactly as advertised. The mechanics of the price revolution are almost elegant, in the way that a collapsing building is structurally interesting on the way down. New World silver flooded into Seville, which flooded into the Spanish economy, which flooded into the rest of Europe, because Spain spent more than it produced and imported the difference. Prices across the continent rose steadily for most of the 16th century. Scholars would later call it the price revolution. Castilian peasants, at the time, called it Tuesday. Here is the paradox that should keep you up at night. Spain was the richest empire in the world and could not manufacture a decent pair of scissors. While silver poured through Seville, Spanish wool merchants discovered it was cheaper to buy finished Flemish cloth than to weave their own. Spanish ironworkers discovered the same thing about tools. Spanish shipbuilders about rope. Why develop an industry when you can simply buy the product? The silver made imports effortless and domestic production pointless, a phenomenon economists would later identify in 20th century oil states and called Dutch disease. Spain got there first, without the terminology and without the eventual recovery plan. The arbitristas noticed. These were Spanish writers and economists, sharp-eyed men like Martín González de Celorigo, who wrote in 1600 that Spain's silver had produced not real wealth but a country that was rich in poor people. He was correct, ignored, and deeply frustrated in roughly that order. González de Celorigo and his fellow arbitristas diagnosed the disease with remarkable precision. They recommended investment in agriculture. They recommended protecting domestic industry. They recommended, in essence, that Spain stop treating its empire as a piggy bank and start treating it as an economy. Philip III's court received their pamphlets, nodded thoughtfully, and continued as before. Meanwhile, in the villages of Castile, the smell of an empty granary was becoming familiar. Drought and plague had already thinned the countryside through the 1590s. The silver economy had drawn workers into cities chasing inflated wages, leaving fields untended. Food prices climbed. Real wages fell. The ships continued docking at Seville, heavy with the weight of Potosi, and the wealth moved up through Genoese bankers toward European war debts, passing over the hungry villages of the empire's heartland without stopping. The richest dynasty in the world was slowly hollowing out the country it called home. Which raises the obvious question of what happened when the ships finally stopped coming. The mines at Potosi produced their peak output around 1600, which, if you have been paying attention, you will recognize as exactly the wrong moment for that to happen. After that peak, the easy silver was gone. The shallow veins were exhausted. The mercury amalgamation process that had made deep extraction possible was itself becoming less efficient as ore quality dropped. Output from Potosi fell through the 1610s, the 1620s, the 1630s, each decade quieter than the last. The counting houses in Seville kept their ledgers. The numbers kept shrinking. And the debts, accumulated across a century of European war, kept compounding at rates that would make a modern credit card company blush. Into this slow-motion disaster stepped Gaspar de Guzman, the Count Duke of Olivares, chief minister to Philip IV, and possibly the most exhausted man in 17th century Europe. Olivares understood the problem with perfect clarity. The Castilian system was broken. The tax burden fell almost entirely on Castile, while the other kingdoms, Aragon, Portugal, Naples, Milan, contributed almost nothing to the wars their king kept starting. His solution, called the Union of Arms, proposed that everyone share the load. Catalonia rebelled in 1640. Portugal rebelled in 1640 and successfully became independent. Olivares was dismissed in 1643, a broken man, and died 2 years later convinced he had failed. He had not failed. The system was simply unreformable, and the difference matters. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 made it official on one front. After 80 years of war, Spain recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic, the very Netherlands that had once been the jewel of Habsburg administration and the transit point for half of Europe's trade. The Spanish negotiators signed. They had little choice. The money was gone. And then there was Charles. Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the product of generations of Habsburg marriage strategy, which had operated on the principle that power was best kept within the family. The family tree, by this point, was less a tree than a repeatedly knotted rope. His parents were uncle and niece. His family had intermarried so consistently across 5 generations that his inbreeding coefficient, which geneticists would later calculate, exceeded that of a child born to siblings. He could not chew properly. His tongue was too large for his mouth. He learned to walk late, spoke late, and never learned much else. He suffered seizures. He was, by most contemporary accounts, in constant pain for most of his 39 years of life. Imagine inheriting the most complicated administrative apparatus in human history and possessing none of the tools to operate it. The machine still ran, after a fashion, because bureaucracies have their own momentum. But it ran without direction, lurching from one crisis to the next, guided largely by whoever stood closest to the king and spoke loudest. What Charles could not do was produce an heir. 2 marriages and no children. The entire Spanish Habsburg succession, that enormous centuries-old machine of silver and ships and conquistadors and inquisitors and painted ceilings and unpayable debts, narrowed to a single sickly man who died in 1700 without a direct successor. He was 39. He had been expected to die in childhood and had confounded everyone by surviving long enough to end the dynasty himself. The will he signed, likely under considerable pressure, left everything to Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France. A Bourbon, not a Habsburg. The Spanish court had decided that keeping the empire intact under a French prince was preferable to watching it carved up by competing European powers. Whether they made the right call would be debated for years, mostly over the sound of cannon fire. The Silver Dynasty was over. What came next was a war over who got to inherit its debts, its titles, and the remnants of its impossible machine. 50 million people lived in the Americas when Columbus landed in 1492. By 1650, roughly 3.5 million indigenous people remained. That is not a statistic so much as a verdict. Disease carried most of them. Smallpox, measles, typhus, moving faster than any army could. But the mines and the encomienda system carried plenty on their own. The Mita at Potosi was not designed to kill workers, technically. It was simply designed without much consideration for whether they lived. When the labor demand is infinite and the available body count is finite, the math resolves itself in a particular direction. Don't worry. The administrators in Seville wrote concerned letters about it. The dynasty ended in 1700. The silver stopped flowing at its old volumes. The formal Habsburg grip on Latin America dissolved over the following century as independence movements, inspired partly by the American and French revolutions, swept the continent between 1810 and 1825. And here is where the story performs its cruelest trick. Independence arrived. The extractive structures did not leave. The hacienda system remained. The land remained in the hands of the families who had received it through colonial grants, and those families were not in the habit of redistributing it. The indigenous and mestizo populations who had worked that land under the Mita and the encomienda continued working it under arrangements that were legally different and practically similar. The mine owners changed their flags and kept their mines. The inequality that the Habsburg system had engineered into the bones of Latin American society did not dissolve because a new generation of Creole elites wrote new constitutions. It calcified. Eduardo Galeano, the Uruguayan writer, named all of this with uncomfortable precision in 1971. His book, Open Veins of Latin America, described the continent as a body that had been bled for centuries, first by European colonizers, then by the economic arrangements those colonizers left behind. The metaphor was Potosi, always Potosi, that mountain of silver that had funded European wars and cathedrals and court fashions and left behind a hollowed landscape and a poisoned workforce. The book was banned by several Latin American dictatorships almost immediately, which is one way of confirming that someone felt seen. Potosi today is among the poorest cities in Bolivia, which is among the poorest countries in South America. The Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, is still there. It is visibly smaller than it was in 1545. Because 3 centuries of extraction will do that to a mountain. An estimated 8 million people died working inside it, by various historical estimates. The city that once had a population larger than London now has crumbling colonial architecture, altitude sickness at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, and very little silver left to show for any of it. This is what the ledger left behind. Not the accounts in Seville, which were lost or destroyed or simply closed when the dynasty ended. The other ledger. The one written in land, tenure patterns, and poverty rates, and the gap between who owns the ground and who works it. Some debts, it turns out, are not the kind that get paid off. They are the kind that get passed down. The International Monetary Fund was founded in 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in a hotel with good curtains and very consequential room service. It was designed, genuinely, with good intentions. Stabilize currencies. Prevent the kind of cascading financial collapse that had fed the Second World War. The architects were serious men with serious spreadsheets and a real belief that coordinated global finance could smooth out the brutal edges of economic catastrophe. Nobody in that conference room was thinking about Potosi. And yet, the IMF's structural adjustment programs, which arrived in earnest across Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia in the 1980s, carried a familiar smell. Loans extended to sovereign nations in crisis, conditional on specific policy changes, privatized state assets, open markets to foreign capital, cut public spending, service the debt first, and ask questions later. The nations that accepted these terms did not lose formal sovereignty. They retained their flags, their constitutions, their presidents. What they surrendered was the practical ability to make economic decisions that contradicted the preferences of their creditors. If this sounds like the relationship between the Spanish crown and the Augsburg banking houses, you are beginning to understand the template. The Habsburgs did not invent this arrangement. The Medicis were doing versions of it a century earlier. The Venetians before them. But the Habsburgs perfected the architecture at continental scale. Extract the resource, borrow against the future extraction, service the loan with the next shipment, keep the dependent territory locked into a role as raw material supplier rather than finished goods. The resource curse, as economists now call it, is precisely this trap. Nations sitting atop extraordinary natural wealth that never translates into broad prosperity because the structural incentives keep routing the value outward. Today, a single multinational corporation can hold more economic leverage over a developing nation than that nation's own government. This is not a conspiracy. It is just the logical endpoint of a system that treats capital mobility as sacred and labor immobility as natural. The Fuggers would have found it completely legible. They would have admired the efficiency improvements. The final irony is a gentle one, as ironies go. The Habsburgs themselves were not the last word in this story. They were eventually devoured by the same logic they had deployed. The debt machine consumed its operators. The template outlived the dynasty by centuries and is running still in boardrooms and bond markets and finance ministry, waiting rooms where officials from small countries sit with large folders and polite expressions, waiting to discuss the terms. Somewhere in all of this, if you listen carefully, you can still hear it. The counting house. The scratch of a quill on vellum, recording a transaction in a ledger that will outlast the person making the entry. The cascade of silver coins into a wooden chest, each one minted from ore pulled out of a mountain by someone who did not profit from the counting. The candle burning low. The numbers adding up to something that is not precisely justice. The Habsburg Empire ended. The Habsburg system simply changed its name and kept its hours.